Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness. My name is Phil, hosting this evening, and we've got a topic around evolution and design, whether or not evolution disproves Christianity. That's what we're going to get stuck straight into. In a moment, we've got about an hour and a half, and we're just going to introduce our guests straight away. So welcome, Zachary. I didn't actually ask, do you go by Zachary or Zach? Does it matter?
I take either, yeah.
You take cool. And Dan is obviously here as well with a very. We just have to go on that background. He's moved into his new house.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
If you're on the podcast, it's lovely geometric wallpaper in the background.
A wood carving of the Great Fire of London from 1666 as well. Not the real thing. It's
not actually on fire. Cool. Anyway, Zachary, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do, and how you became a Christian? Let's start with that.
Yes, I'm a biologist, currently based in Germany. I was from New Zealand before that, and I was raised in a Christian family, and like a lot of people, started taking it seriously to a greater extent in high school. And then I realized, at some point, I realized that most of my friends were atheists, and started thinking about how does Christianity relate to that. Some of the books I started reading first were actually on biblical archaeology, because I kind of thought, well, is this stuff really real? Can we trust it? So I started digging into biblical archaeology a bit, and then the next thing I dug into was science, and realized that was really important for atheists. And atheists were saying that was the basis of their belief. And I guess after that, I studied science and studied philosophy, and have been thinking about these questions for the last 15 years.
Cool. So both science and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So is that a philosophy degree or just for fun?
Both, yeah. So I did the philosophy degree for fun, I guess. I realized that I wasn't going to get a job out of it. So I fortunately stuck with the science for the job. And I think that was a good decision.
Sounds very sensible.
Awesome.
I guess a good place to start would be what exactly. So would you describe yourself as an evolutionary biologist, or?
Yeah. Maybe just because I like the title, but I do research evolution. So I study how bacteria mostly.
Got you. So what I guess for people listening, what exactly could you just sort of give a summary of what exactly evolutionary biology is?
Yeah, it's really diverse. So when someone says they're an evolutionary biologist, it could mean lots of different things, actually. In my case, it means that I look at the DNA sequences of bacteria, and sometimes the last year was looking at SARS-CoV-2 viruses, and in my PhD, I was looking at yeast, so a single-celled eukaryote. But for the last few years, I've mostly been looking at bacteria. I'm looking at differences between different species of bacteria, the processes of evolution, and how things change over time in bacteria. But other evolutionary biologists might be looking at fossils, they might be looking at ecosystems, they might be looking at animals or birds or behaviors or human culture or the evolution of religion. So evolution is a huge, huge field, but I'm interested in the molecular details, what's happening at the DNA level, particularly in bacteria, because they're easy to study in depth. You can really, you can get a lot of detail in bacterial evolution.
So when you were starting out, was there any, so you grew up in a Christian family and then got into science, was there any sort of conflict early on that you had to sort of pass out, or?
Yeah. So I was kind of a young Earth creationist. As a teenager, I'd kind of absorbed that. And then I kind of, shifted into old Earth creationism of some kind. But at university, I was then hit with really atheistic biology professors who were really, I would say, they were basically preaching atheism in their biology lectures, which was an abuse of power. Like they had a lot of power there, because some of these were like senior professors that were highly respected. A lot of the people in the class, they wanted to get into medical school, so their grades really mattered. So they were really, they paid a lot of attention to what the professor said, and I think professors have a lot of power like that. And yeah, so they were preaching atheism and really bashing young earth creationism. They actually made me more creationist because they weren't fairly presenting creationism. They were straw manning it. So for a brief time, I really kind of dug into it and maybe kind of fell back into young earth creationism, but I slowly worked out what I think is kind of a middle road that allows for design whilst also allowing for evolutionary processes.
Okay, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
So I guess going from that, just working on my question. So with the evolutionary processes, I guess my instinctual question is, maybe it's diving straight in. Is there like a evidence for jumping from species to species? That's like my main question about evolution. So do you have like evidence of that in the sense that when we talk about evolution, that's probably like okay, I'm going to show my ignorance. Is there even a thing like macro, micro? Is that terminology used in your role, in your job?
It depends on the biologist. That's kind of a quiet ongoing debate whether it even makes sense to talk about macro and micro as something distinct, or whether macro is just micro over a long period of time. So that's kind of an open question, whether there might be different processes that you need to appeal to explain the larger things. So differences in body plans between organisms, for instance. There'll be differences at the level of development in animals. So some people might think that there's maybe that's a different kind of evolution than what we tend to see within species. But that's kind of a debate that's not clear. I guess I would tend to say unless it's really shown definitively, then I'm happy to think that micro is enough if it's accrued over time. Is there evidence? That will depend what you mean by evidence. And I think a lot of people who approach this have a really narrow concept of evidence. Like, unless you can see it happening before your eyes, then there's no evidence. But I think this similar kinds of evidence as we use in forensics, we can also use. It's actually a similar inference that we make when we're inferring evolution, because in both cases we're talking about past processes. So if people want to draw a sharp cutoff between, like a lot of people do this, they say there's a big difference between like present day science and historical science. But I really don't think there is. And something like forensics shows that pretty much everyone accepts forensics as a legitimate kind of science, and it makes legitimate inferences, or archaeology also. But those are both historical, and evolution is another historical science. I mean, there's heaps of things to say. You do see some evidence. I mean, so my PhD was laboratory evolution, so evolving microorganisms in the lab, and you see over a few hundred generations, you do see evolution happen. You see changes at the DNA level, you see gene copy number changes and other things. But for the interspecies differences, I mean, there's a couple of examples that are presented, but most of those, they're going to be inferences based on the kinds of similarities we see between organisms. And actually, increasingly, creationists, including young earth creationists, they do actually accept interspecies difference. It's at a higher level that they say. So there's different biological categories like species, genus, family, order, class, and it's one of these higher taxonomic levels. The creationists say, no, evolution doesn't go beyond that point. But pretty much everyone nowadays says that, yes, species can change. So the average person who's a creationist wouldn't realize that. They would think that you can't get different species. But actually, all creationist biologists will say, yes, getting species is not the problem. It's the higher levels.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. Dan, you got a question?
So I guess, I mean, what sort of evidence? I mean, Christians, for a lot of Christians, just the whole notion of evolution gets their back up. Like, there's something about it that their understanding of evolution is answering questions that they believe could be are answered by God, and so by suggested by they're sort of competing categories. So it almost seems like an oxymoron to have a Christian who's who believes in the evolutionary process over time. So what is it? I guess what sort of evidence you have for evolution over time? So I think, like you said, most people, even if you look like young Earth creationists, they'll, like Phil was saying, they'll distinguish between micro evolution and macro evolution, and agree that there's clearly evidence that of evolution on a micro level, but not on a level that can kind of get you from from single celled organisms to the 37.5 trillion cells that constitute a human body. So what's the sort of best evidence for that, do you think? Is there anything that you can point to that would plausibly persuade someone that's skeptical of that process?
Just before you answer that question, sorry, again, this terminology, I'm just checking, is that what this means? Primary speciation has never been shown to occur. Is that what we're talking about with going from single cell to humans? Is that primary speciation?
I think they're saying that you can't, so I think he's saying that you can't get evolution between species. And if you just Google for examples of speciation, there are some that are at least claimed in the literature. So I would just disagree with that.
Sorry, the question Dan was asking.
Sorry.
What evidence of single cell to complex?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting. There's kind of an analogy between skeptics and how they approach the God question. Because skeptics will say, skeptics can kind of act in a similar way to skeptics of evolution. So skeptics can say, what's your best evidence? Show me the evidence. And they kind of want like one knockout piece of evidence. And then they think, oh, that's not good enough. Therefore, there's no reason to believe in God, for instance, the skeptic of God. And the skeptic of evolution can do the same thing. And I think the dialectic is often the same. And I think the answer is actually the same as well, that it's actually a cumulative case. And this is how Darwin approached it. He had a really nice term that he got from the philosopher William Whewell, who was a apologist, actually, a Christian philosopher, theologian. And William Whewell talked about consilience. And that's the idea of different lines of evidence that kind of fit together. And the fact they fit together kind of gives extra strong reason to believe the conclusion. So Darwin appealed to the fossil record, and he appealed to biogeography, so the distribution of animals across space and time. And he appealed to differences within species and things. And we can appeal to other lines of evidence like genetics, particularly, which I think is really strong. So there's multiple lines of evidence that all seem to point in basically the same direction. And when taken together, I think it's very strong. And I'd say it's actually the same with the case for God, that there's arguments that are quite strong by themselves, but together turn out to be very strong.
So I guess what would be some of those things? Could you give an example of some of those things that once they're sort of packaged together, you understand to be persuasive?
Yeah, so I mentioned the fossil record and biogeography and genetics. But just quickly, I think another issue is that often opponents of evolution conflate in a bunch of other things with evolution. So for instance, when they say evolution, they're thinking of the age of the Earth as well. Or when they think of the age of the Earth, they label that as evolution. So if someone says they believe the Earth is old, then the creationists might say, oh, that's an evolutionary viewpoint. And I think it's really helpful to separate these things out, that these are quite different issues. If we first accept that the Earth is old, and that can be based on quite separate evidence, nothing to do with biology, from astronomy, from the distant starlight, from geology, from the radioisotope dating of rocks, for instance. So there are different kind of physical science reasons to believe the universe is old. Once we've got that, then within that we can look at the fossil record and see that as a history of life over time. If you're a young Earth creationist, then you'll have a different view of the fossil record. But if you've already accepted that the Earth is old, then you have to accept that there is some kind of development over time. That in the very bottom fossil layers, there's just bacteria. And then there's simple animals and fish and plants, and the higher animals, the most complex animals like humans and other mammals are only found in the top layers. And this basic picture of development is one of the key evidences of evolution, because there's some kind of development that we need to account for. And that seems surprising on a creationist picture, and fully what we expect on an evolutionary picture. But that's just the first evidence. And then there's more detailed evidences about the kinds of fossils we see, the similarities between animals, the nested hierarchy and similarities. So all of that was very strong even at Darwin's time. But since then, we've added genetics, which is a completely kind of separate line, which seems to show the same patterns as the differences between organisms that Darwin could see. Yeah, so we could talk about each of those things for a long time, but basically there are these different lines of evidence, and I think when we're taken together, it's cumulatively pretty strong.
Sounds good.
So what in terms of the genetics would you understand to be evidence? I mean, are there sort of clues within genes that would lead us to believe that that human beings are the result of hundreds of millions of billions of years of an evolutionary process?
Yeah, so starting with human beings is always going to be touchy. So I think it's helpful to look at other animals and just kind of leave humans off to the side to start with, and just ask, for instance, do we think that mice and rats are related? Like mice and rats are pretty similar. At the genetic level, they're also they're very similar. I think they're around 90% similar. Or lions and tigers, for instance, they're also pretty similar, but quite a bit of difference as well. They're also, I think, around 90% similarity at the DNA level. And so what we see at the genetic level of organisms is there are these nested hierarchies. So we have things that cluster together, like lions and tigers are pretty similar, and then we can go outwards and outwards and outwards. And the taxonomic system that was invented before Darwin acknowledged that. Linnaeus, the Linnaean taxonomic system, classification system, grouped organisms by these nested hierarchies. So it grouped them into species, and then into genera, and then into families, and then into orders, and then into classes, and then into phyla. So we have this kind of nested hierarchy is what it's called, of similarities, and the genetics basically backs that up. And this is the kind of pattern you expect from descent. This is the pattern we see just within human populations in terms of descent. That I'm more similar to my brother, and then less similar to my cousin, and then less similar to a second cousin or whatever. You can go further out, and so this is the kind of pattern that descent leaves, and I think it's hard to explain on an alternative view. So yeah, that's the basics of the genetic evidence, and then there's various detailed genetic evidences as well, which can also be looked into.
So I know that you were saying something about a middle ground, but I think it's interesting some of the things you're saying about the age of the Earth. And one of the biggest things that I view as evidence for the age of the Earth is the way that light travels. I remember studying that as physics, and the way that we see light that's millions of years old. So that for me was like, okay, there's something about this that I don't see a good answer to within the young Earth literature that I've engaged with. But I've also come to a middle road where I'm like, if one fights it out and wins over the other, I'm okay. Faith-wise, Genesis-wise, I'm okay. I can work with it. I don't think that's what Genesis 1 is about, but I'm happy to talk that through. But I think there's some interesting questions that have come through that I think would be interesting to just bring up in response to what you're saying. And some of these terms are probably physics beyond my understanding, but I'm happy to give it a go. So this one's, and feel free to pass.
Yeah, I mean, it passed. There's no reason that an evolution biologist should try and answer questions on cosmology.
And
young Earth creationists usually, and my impression is that they generally accept that cosmology, astrophysics, is a problem for them, actually. And there's plenty of young Earth creation scientists who'll say that is one of the big unsolved problems. So I don't think there are good creationist models of these things. They've been kind of There's some old models, but they were rejected, and they keep producing new models occasionally and rejecting those. So that this is one of the big open questions for young universe people, I think, and that's generally acknowledged. So yeah, I'm happy to leave that to physicists because they've got that sorted.
That's cool, and hopefully at some point we will have physicists on. I think that's really helpful actually, because I do come across it does feel like Christians often feel like they have to be the expert on every field, and I appreciate the response. Some things we just have to say that's not my field. I'm happy to rely on others.
I mean, I could take a stab at these things, but I'm a big fan of specialization. Actually, I think Christians should do what they're gifted at, and let other people deal with other things.
Yeah, and the pushback is that it's a problem for both sides. I'm aware there are some issues. I'm not sure. Happy to have a look at that.
There are some more biology type questions.
I'm trying to find them. There's one about gene network evolve. Is that something you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, also I'm not an expert on that. There's a nice blog that I'm aware of. I can't remember the guy who wrote it, but he's a leading evolution biologist who wrote on that topic at Biologos, which is a theistic evolution site. I'm blanking on his name, but if you look up that question on Biologos, then fairly maybe a year or so ago, there was a really nice article from one of the leaders in evolutionary theory, who is an evangelical Christian, who wrote on that specific topic. So I think it's overstated the effect to which changes in the gene regulatory network is catastrophic, which is what they're saying here. Yeah, that's a massive topic. That's a little bit because I study bacteria. I don't study animals, and that's more of an animal development kind of question.
That's fair enough. Dan, do you have another question on the tip of your tongue, or shall I go through some?
Well, I was just trying to get some, because I imagine we'll get quite a few questions on the chat, so I'd rather, for now, just go through some of the questions on there that are relevant, and then. Yeah,
that's fine. So, just because they're responding to what you've said already, Zachary, we'll just kind of have a look at some of these. So, one of the things that you mentioned was the fossil record. How clued up on the fossil record are you?
Not super clued up again, mate. I mean, evolution's a massive field, but
it's huge. I mean, creation in general, origins is a massive field. So I'll be interested though, like in terms of just a sort of casual discussion, because I've done some teaching on science and God and why science doesn't disprove God, and generally when I do that, I present different views of creation and how this is an ongoing debate. There's not really going to be settled this side of new creation, I don't think, but I'm aware of things like the Cambrian explosion. I'm not aware of what is said here. Fossils are irrelevant, but if so, how does Zachary explain the origin of trilobite eyes and the Cambrian explosion? So I don't see how the Cambrian explosion defeats evolution at all. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, you guys might know, but a Cambrian explosion is a point in time where simple-celled or single-celled, less complex organisms suddenly in the timeline became more complex organisms, and there was a proliferation of more complex organisms at that point in time. I think evolution can account for that. Now, again, trilobite eyes is about complexity, if I'm remembering my literature correctly. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, so the Cambrian explosion is the origin of the animal body plan. So most of the major animal phyla, I think, originated in a relatively short space of time, evolutionarily speaking, in the Cambrian era. I think around 500 million and something years ago. And so before that, there were multicellular organisms, but they weren't really animals, I think, in the modern sense. So various phyla, it's debated exactly how many, but various phyla of animals arose in a relatively short period of time. So people say, how did that happen? And that is an open question for evolutionary biology, but it doesn't get rid of the fact that there are still just bacteria at the bottom, and then there's more complex organisms, and then there's animals. So there is still that general progression. And there are open questions regarding the mechanisms, but that doesn't refute the overall pattern. So you can talk about the pattern of evolution and the process of evolution. There's definitely a bunch of open questions on the processes involved, but the pattern is I think, very clear, personally. And also, I find that, if this objection was taken seriously and was the main objection that people had, then they would already be granting a lot of evolution, because it's a huge amount of evolution after the Cambrian explosion within phyla. So most creationists actually want to dispute the difference, the common descent of humans and chimpanzees, or rats and mice maybe, or mice and elephants. They want to debate that. And attacking evolution at the phylum level is just like way upstream. So to me, it doesn't seem to get them with what they actually want. But for someone who's not a biologist, they think, oh, okay, evolution's been disproved. Actually, it's attacking the tree right at the roots, whereas creationists actually need to attack the tree at the upper levels as well.
I know someone in the comments mentioned bacteria. Mm-hmm. What is the role of bacteria in evolution? Because I know there's sort of hypothesis, or it might be more than that, about the role of bacteria and mitochondria and that's role in the evolutionary development. Could you explain a little bit more about that, the role of bacteria in evolution?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is the origin of the eukaryotic cell. So there's two kinds of cells. Well, I mean, there's more than two, but there's prokaryotes that don't have a nucleus, and eukaryotes that do have a nucleus. And the idea is that it seems that early in the evolution of eukaryotes, maybe at the origin of eukaryotes, but I don't think that's the standard view. I think it's the standard view is that it happened a bit later. Early in the evolution of eukaryotes, or maybe around the origin, there was a merger between two kinds of cells that led to modern eukaryotes, and that gave them extra energy resources because they used something that was very much like a modern bacterium as a subcomponent of the eukaryotic cell. So I think that's called the phagocytosis model, that there was a merger of two kinds of cells. And that seems to be well supported because the genetics of the mitochondria has a separate genome, and the genetics of that fit in remarkably well within bacteria. Yeah.
Okay. So we wouldn't have us if there hadn't been if that hadn't occurred. Would that be accurate?
Right, and before that there were just bacteria anyway, or bacteria and archaea, which are another kind of prokaryote. So yeah, bacteria are super important in all kinds of ways, but one of them is some involvement in the origin of eukaryotes. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. A bit of a response to that, directly to merger. We're starting to talk language that's beyond me. If there's a merger, how did the standard genetic code evolve to the mitochondrial code? And how did a reduction from millions of nucleotides occur in the bacteria to 20,000 in mitochondria?
These are really easy questions to answer, I think, because the mitochondrial code is very similar to the standard code. So it only requires relatively minor changes in I'm not sure how many, I think maybe a couple of tRNAs. So in the scheme of things, there's not a massive problem for evolution. There's much trickier questions. And losing genes is very easy. That happens a lot. So parasites, parasitic bacteria, they usually have, they tend to have smaller genomes, sometimes much, much smaller genomes than free living bacteria. So if a bacteria is living inside a host cell, it doesn't need as much equipment. It can borrow the equipment or hijack the equipment of the host. So it can lose a lot of genes, and that just happens all the time. So the idea of gene loss that's not a problem. So those are not big issues for evolution, I think. Minor changes in the genetic code for a parasitic or a symbiotic situation like the mitochondria, I think that's straightforward as well. Yeah, but I mean, there's heaps of different things we can talk about in terms of The differences between ID and old Earth creationism and evolution, there's one thing we could talk about. We could talk about the theology of Genesis. How do we interpret that? Could talk about, is natural theology even worthwhile? We could talk about science and atheism.
It'd be good to start moving into that direction. I just noticed one more question on mechanism, and then we'll start moving into the theological implications. What is the mechanism by which an organism gains a system or a new feature like a heart, brain, digestive system? Is there a mechanism that's known, or how does that work?
Yes, I'm not an expert on animal evolution. But basically this is increasing specialization of a subset of cells within a multicellular organism. And it's not going to be like, an animal wakes up and has a new brain the next day. Obviously, these things in evolutionary theory are gradual and happen at the population level over many thousands of generations. There's small changes, but we do see new stuff happening in evolution. So even in the very small laboratory experiments I was working with, you see a duplication of a gene. So you see a new copy of a gene that appears just in a couple of hundred generations. And this happens all the time. You see chromosomes get copied and then they change. You see new stuff happening in evolution all the time. And the question is the sum of these changes enough to account for evolution? And I think basically it is, given some provisos. I mean, I don't think this process was unintended. I don't think it was just random. That's a separate question, which we can go into maybe. But the general question of, can the mechanisms that we see account for the diversity in life? Yes, because there's nothing that I see in the diversity of life that necessitates some other kind of explanation, as far as I can see. We see at the small level, we see changes in chromosome number, we see changes in gene number, we see all kinds of mutations. So I haven't seen the cutoff point, basically, which is what I want to see if I was to reject evolution.
I think I'd be interested to see what you think. I mean, in terms of, I think a lot of Christians are not necessarily impressed by changes on that micro level. I think when you look at, like you're saying, how many hundreds or thousands of generations can occur in a very short period of time with bacteria and viruses, we've seen with COVID. But when you start getting on to the higher animals, sort of mammals and things like that, you're talking about, if you look at the how long a whale can live, or a shark can live, or a turtle can live, you're getting onto decades, in some cases hundreds of years. And so for changes to occur, you require a lot more time at that level. So I can see why it seems implausible. I think it's so easy to accept that changes happen on the micro level, but it's less difficult to conceive of how those very small changes can result in such big differences. In the variety of different mammalian animals that exist, and how we ended up with human beings. The amount of time involved is vast. I mean, and that's why I often hear from young earth creationists as well. All evolutionists are really saying is that, given enough time, anything can happen. And I think that's a very simple way of understanding it, but I think that's often how it comes across, is that if we just have enough time, you get human beings or organisms like us. I'll be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'd say it's more quantified than that. So we can quantify the level of change that we see in a small space of time, and we can say, and then we can say, okay, the Earth from complete independent measures is this age. So we say, okay, we can extrapolate this space of this amount of evolution over a given time. And then that does account for, say, the differences we see between a mouse and a rat. We can work out from the fossils roughly, at least to within an order of magnitude or whatever. We can relatively straightforwardly work out the amount of time that we have for some of these changes. And I haven't seen, at least at the kind of the rough level, of the amount of genetic material that has to change. I think it adds up, basically. It matches what you would expect if you just extrapolate the mutations we see in the small scale over the amount of time that geology tells us was available. Then it basically matches the kind of changes we see at the genetic level between organisms. So people may point to, I'm sure they'll point to some counterexamples, but I think I don't think the counterexamples are massive. We don't see things that are wildly out of kilter. So some biologists, I think it was JBS Haldane or one of the early biologists, said, someone asked him, what would it take to disprove evolution? He said, oh, it's easy, a rabbit in the pre-Cambrian. So if you see a modern complex mammal in the space where you only see very simple organisms, and then that would, in his view, disprove evolution. And that's the kind of thing we don't see. I don't think we see these. I think we see things basically at the kind of time and place that we would expect from an evolutionary unfolding of life.
Cool. So I'm just guessing that you mean, would that be seen in the layers of things? Is that what you're okay? So yeah. I'm very well aware we're not going to disprove evolution tonight, and that's not really the purpose of tonight. I'd be interested in the sort of theological aspects of this. So I'm going to sort of one very often leveled view from popular young Earth creation speakers is that you're reading the Bible when you come to the Bible. If you're trying to harmonize evolution and the Bible, you're having to manipulate scripture from an atheistic perspective. So I guess before we get to the Bible, I'd be interested in just hearing your story. Like, how do you? Is evolution atheistic? Let's start with that. Is it an atheistic model that you're starting off with? Have you had that question before? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's like I kind of hinted at before. It's really important, I think, to get the age of the Earth thing. So personally, that's how I would approach it first. Is can we come to terms with an old Earth? Can we fit an old Earth in with Scripture? If we can't, then evolution is dead from a Christian perspective. And if we can, then at least the door's open, right? Then we can talk about it. But I think it's impossible to persuade or have a reasonable conversation with someone if these two things are kind of conflated together. Because then if you push back against one, then I think people just lean on the other. Like if you just push on the age of the Earth, then people they have a gut instinct against evolution. And that will be pulling them back towards the young Earth. And if you try and attack the evolution and try and persuade them that evolution is real, but they're convinced that the Earth is young, then it's going to be impossible. So that's why I think it's most helpful to firstly maybe something like old Earth creationism of some kind is true. This was held by distinguished evangelicals like Charles Spurgeon, who you might not expect. Very conservative people. Charles Spurgeon's sermons, for some reason, are found at the Answers in Genesis website, which is really strange. But he was some kind of old Earth creationist, actually. So that's another thing, that people were old Earthers before Darwin. Because Charles Spurgeon was saying some of this stuff a little bit before Darwin. So evangelicals in the UK were largely old Earth before Darwin. So it's I think one of the main problems in discussing this is that these things still get conflated, not explicitly, but they're implicitly, and they're driving a lot of the discussion, I think. Most of the theological questions actually are to do with the age of the Earth. They're to do with, or implicitly to do with the age of the Earth, like death before sin. Yeah. If you have fossils before you have Adam and Eve, then you have death before sin. And that's nothing to do with evolution per se. That old Earth creationists have exactly the same issue. So there's not much theologically that's actually specifically to do with evolution. So yeah.
What's the role of God in the evolutionary process? Because obviously most evolutionary biologists do not posit God as having any directive role in the process. So they obviously, their presupposition is that the process functions without any external guidance. Whereas you are a theist, Christian theist, and you accept that I'm assuming God guided that process or had some involvement. I'm not sure, or just sat back and wound the clock and let it get to result in human beings. So what exactly, from your perspective, can evolution work without God, or what exactly is God's role from your perspective in the evolutionary process?
Yeah, so there's heaps of things to say there, but so one thing is that I don't take a standard theistic evolution view, but I could still defend that view. I think it's still, I can see why people might take it. But when I was exploring these things as an undergraduate, I was really repulsed by the theistic evolution stuff I came across, because it was really liberal theologically. I would say it was just really sloppy theology. I just found it off-putting coming from an evangelical context. And so that was one reason why I was kind of skeptical of evolution, is that the theology I saw was not where I was coming from. But since then, I found that actually there's huge diversity on this theologically and there were early evangelicals, and ever since there's been evangelicals who were at least open to evolution, or even very actively Darwinian. So, for instance, the authors of the fundamentals, the pamphlets from which we get the name, or the booklets from which we get the name fundamentalist, some of the authors of these fundamentals booklets were actually pro-evolution. Okay, remind me of your question. Sorry,
What's the purpose of God in evolution?
Sorry. How's God involved? Yeah, so the standard theistic evolution view would be that there's differences on this, but would be that God is not really detectably involved, but you don't need to detect him scientifically to say that God is involved. So they would say it's the same way that God is involved in the weather, for instance. We can't make a design argument from the weather. We can't say, okay, there was a thunderstorm on Friday, therefore God exists. And I think basically, not many people try and do something like that. And so theistic evolutionists will say it was the same with biology, that these are natural processes, but God is sovereign over natural processes. So God, so in the same way that God is, or in a similar way to which God is sovereign over natural law, he's also sovereign over the natural laws that are involved in evolution. And that's fine as like a minimal position, I think, for a theist to hold to. And for someone like myself who has a high view of God's sovereignty, so someone maybe more on the reformed side of things, that's maybe going to be particularly appealing. There's different ways for other theological schools to do that. But if you think that God really is sovereign over all the little things of life, then he's also going to know the evolutionary outcomes before they occur. And he doesn't have to be sitting back and just watching it, because he's upholding the universe every second. So then there's not a distinction between. So I'm not so comfortable with that, because it doesn't draw any distinction between providence and creation. And I would think maybe there is a distinction there. I think God is doing something different in creation than he's doing in his providential upholding of the universe. So how is God involved on my view? He's involved in setting up the specifics of the evolutionary process, at least. I would say the evolutionary process is fine-tuned in similar way to which physics is fine-tuned. Maybe he's involved at some other points as well, like the origin of life, or the Cambrian explosion, or the origin of humans. Theologically, I would say that. Scientifically, I'm not sure if I have evidence for that's kind of an open question scientifically, whether we can say something about the evidence for maybe something beyond normal evolutionary processes at certain points. But the point that I argue as an apologetic from the science is that it looks to me like evolution needs to be fine-tuned to work. And that seems to fit with theism better than it fits with naturalism.
I think that's something that I've come across in the sort of very shallow dive I've done into this. But the Cambrian explosion, for example, seems like there's not many solid naturalistic answers for why such a time happened, like with these more complex life forms coming out at once.
Yeah,
there's not a very good explanation for that. So it is interesting to me that that's occurred, that there's not very good explanations on naturalism. Well, that would imply, or at least be, theism does give a good answer to that, as far as I understand it.
Theistic evolutionists are going to be really wary about that because they don't want godly gaps. And that's the big risk when you say, oh, there's a hole in evolution. Okay, God must be active there.
Of course,
so that's why I take the different route, which is the fine-tuning approach. So insofar as evolution does work, even when the most successful evolutionary explanations, I would say, actually rely on basically a prior fine-tuning of the evolution.
I think, I'm not just on that God of the gaps point. I'm not sure that is, because I'd agree that fine-tuning all across, but there seems to be a specific point where something more may have happened. I'm not sure. Maybe it is God of the gaps.
And they're not, in terms of from the evolutionary perspective, you not say that often evolution is guided by, environmental pressures. And so, given how long ago, we don't know, what sort of environmental pressures were present at that time to bring about changes. I mean, what's the kind of, I guess, probably staying back your expertise, I don't know, the role of epigenetics in evolution, and what role does that play in change?
I think not a major role, but this is kind of one of the areas that's kind of being explored by the extended evolutionary synthesis. So that there are some papers starting to come out about this. But personally, I guess I'm skeptical that that's playing a big role. But maybe that's just my bias because I'm really focused on the genetics. But to me, it's not clear. There's at least a lot more work to do to show actual mechanisms here that could be involved in major changes. So I would think maybe it's a small kind of, there's some small feedback happening there through epigenetic mechanisms, but I don't think it's going to do a lot in terms of evolutionary explanation, because the big driver of biology, I think, is genetics. So at some point the genes need to change because we see that genes are different between organisms, and I think it's going to be some kind of mutational process that's going to be doing that. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to some of the more theological conversations. I mean, Genesis 1 has been brought up, and one of the statements in the comments is you can't have Genesis 1 as and evolution. They can't go together at all. And one of the follow-up things is the translation of Yom, which is the Hebrew for day. So I'd be interested in, again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I've done some reading on this, but I'd be interested in how you've sort of harmonized Genesis 1, and as maybe go into a bit more detail the model that you hold to. That would be interesting.
Yeah. So again, I would say this is not evolution. This is, I really think evangelicals who are anti-evolution, they're playing on, and if they use this in this kind of context, they're playing on the gut reaction that other evangelicals have against evolution. Because when I was growing up, I experienced it, and I saw people around me have that when something about evolution came on the news or evolution came up, there was kind of a, like, oh, that's not a Christian thing, that's a bad thing. And there's still, I think, a widespread kind of Christian feeling against evolution. So if you label your opponent's perspective as evolutionary, then that immediately kind of is poisoning the well, basically. So the question of the length of the days, there's nothing to do with evolution. That was something that people before Darwin had to deal with, and it's something that we have to deal with, regardless of evolution. So I would just keep stressing that, because I think otherwise people keep falling back into using evolution as kind of to poison the well. My preferred view is the analogical days view that's advocated particularly by C. John Collins. And this is the idea that the 6 days of creation are analogous to a Hebrew work week of 6 days. And I think there's, for me, some of the strongest reasons for thinking the 6 days are not literal is that the New Testament I think, teaches that the seventh day was an ongoing day that continues into up to the time of Jesus and the time of the New Testament authors. And I didn't come prepared with the verses, so I keep forgetting them. Actually, I think it's Hebrews 4 and John 6, maybe it's John 5. That I think seem to teach that. So Hebrews 4 is about entering God's rest, and it's talking about the Sabbath. And I think it's pretty clearly saying that the rest that God started at creation week, that is continuing until today, and that's the rest that we can enter into. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that Jesus, when talking about the Sabbath, he says, he's basically saying that God's Sabbath has continued until today, and that's part of the structure of his argument. I can't make sense of his argument apart from understanding that God's Sabbath continued until that time. So that's just very briefly. So if it's true that the seventh day is a continuing day, I think that demolishes the young earth case for a literal 7 days, because the young earth case relies a lot on, I think it's Deuteronomy 20. I might be getting these verses completely messed up, but I think it's Deuteronomy 20, which is about the Sabbath. And for in 6 days, God made the world basically and rested on the seventh. And young earth creationists put a lot of weight on these verses. But if the seventh day is not a literal day, then I think that demolishes the insistence on the other days being a literal day.
Yeah, I mean, there's that's what I was going to point to. There's so many problems with that. Like you pointed out, the seventh day has no morning and evening.
Right. So we see it in Genesis, and then it's referred to in the Psalms, and then it's referred to in the New Testament. That I think the seventh day is clearly an ongoing day from the whole canon of Scripture. And then that, if that's the case, and each of the days are somehow related to each other, even back in Deuteronomy, I think it destroys the idea that I think Tertullian also said that the fact the sun is made on day 4,
3,
but there would day 3. Sorry, is it
3? I think it's 3.
Is it? I was just looking.
I think it's
maybe it is 4.
Is it? I think it's 4 because there's the parallel between day 1 and day 4. So in day 1, God makes the light, and day 4, God makes the thing to fill there's the framework view, which I think is also important. But so Tertullian recognized, and early, I think even Philo maybe recognized something like this, that we define a day in relation to the sun. And yet the sun was created on day 4. So what were the first 3 days? They weren't. We don't have reason to insist that they were literal days in our sense, because days in our sense couldn't exist without a sun. So together those things, I think, just very, very clearly. So increasingly, I see young earth creationists don't actually focus on this issue at all. They focus on the idea of the suffering before the fall. That's the key. That's the key thing for them. I think they've basically quietly given up at least from the scholarly side, I think they've kind of given up the insistence on the 24-hour days. Yeah,
the arguments for literal 24-hour periods are extremely implausible.
It's also that it starts with evening.
Yeah,
it starts with evening, and then there's morning, and that's the day. I mean, we don't count our days that way. So I think this is an interesting point, though. Just to point out the connection with the seventh day, with Jesus' cross on the 6th day, rested in the grave in the Sabbath, and then the first day of new creation. I think that's an important theme that I think is very important to recognise. And there's just a few more comments regarding the literalness of the word day, and I think it's important to point out that we're not disagreeing with the literalness of the word day. We're quite happy that Yom means day, and I think that the model that you said, C. John Collins, it sounds very similar to what John Morton would. I think it sounds similar.
John Morton.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I haven't really read his. I've heard his stuff, but yeah.
It sounds quite similar. I don't know if he's worked alongside C. John Collins on this, but the fact is we're reading it literally in the sense that it's meant to be read, and having read some of the young earth creationist stuff on Genesis 1, I mean, the argument is that it's got to be literal history, otherwise it's lies. And I just find that a very wooden way to read literature of any sort. And so while it is truth, and while it's God's inspired word, and it's authoritative, and it's all of that evangelical stuff that we hold dear, I think to read it so like
unnaturally, it's an unnatural reading, because no one in the ancient world, well, very few, it wasn't obviously read in that way. And I think Augustine is a good person to look at a little bit later, the way that he looked at Genesis. There was no consensus on this. It wasn't a litmus test for how seriously you took scripture. It's something that arose very much in the 19th century and still ongoing today. And we can have competitions. I know people in the comments, well, here's this scholar. Well, for every that it will just be, there's no scholarly consensus on this. And for every scholar you name, I'll name two. So there's no winning in terms of arguments from scholarly or authority, because from you look at ancient Jewish scholars, you look at early church fathers, there was always a broad view on this, and the dogmatism that some Christians take, the lack of charity towards Christians who disagree is quite frustrating. It's not a litmus test. There is the gospel, and whatever your views are on Genesis 1 are wholly irrelevant. And if it's frustrating when people set up a sort of stumbling block before Jesus. Sorry, there's my ramblings.
There's a few things I want to quickly say, since this thing is brought up. Firstly, I disagree with some of Walton's stuff around his interpretation of, he thinks that Genesis is all about function, it's not about material creation. So I would disagree with that. I think it is about material creation. And I really like C. John Collins, and he argues well that his view of day is also a literal view. And there's a really nice debate actually between C. John Collins, or Jack Collins, and Albert Mohler. And I would say personally that Mohler basically gets destroyed in this debate. And Mohler's a smart guy, but he was out of his depth on this topic. So there's at some Baptist theological seminary, people can look up the debate on YouTube between C. John Collins and Albert Mohler. And Collins, I think, really nicely shows the kind of things that we briefly hinted at. Also, another thing to highlight that John Lennox raises as well is that there's some precedents for this kind of discussion in history with regards to heliocentrism. So people used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe, basically the sun went around it. And people defended this from the Bible. So even Martin Luther, it seems, defended this strongly. He thought you can't say, so he was a modern equivalent to the young earth creationists on this issue, but he thought that from the scripture you can't say that the earth goes around the sun. And now everyone, apart from a tiny minority of young earth creationists, pretty much everyone says no, that's fine. You've just got to read scripture more carefully. And this is what most of the people at the time also said. If the science shows it, then we're going to need to read scripture in a different way, and that's okay. There's another thing I wanted to say, and I think it's really interesting on this issue that some of the strongest young earth creationists are Seventh-day Adventists, and there's a connection there. I think. I mean, one reason that Seventh-day Adventists are young earth creationists is because their prophetess Ellen White said something about it. But I think there's also a deeper issue to do with the way they deal with the Sabbath, because they have this really strict view of the Sabbath, that this ties in with their insistence on the literalness of the 7 days. And I think this is true with some other Christians as well. It's a particular view of the Sabbath that actually ties in with young earth creationism, that I think basically falls apart when you think that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is an ongoing day, and it's somehow symbolic of it's related to God's reign over the whole universe, God's rest since creation. For theology people to dig into, I think that's something to dig into why is it that Seventh-day Adventists are so strong on young Earth creationism, and it's to do with the Sabbath. And I think it's a mistake that Seventh-day Adventists make that most Christians would recognize on that issue. I think it trickles over to young Earth creationism as well.
Interesting.
One of the things that frustrates sometimes is Christian. I don't know if you agree. This sort of Christian interpretation of Genesis sometimes is you start to focus into this. It becomes so rooted in this evolution, young Earth creationist debate that you forget what's actually incredibly special about the early chapters of Genesis and the fact of what they're really saying. You know, the fact that they're, as a cosmogony, are, polemical against other ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies like the Egyptians and Assyrians and Mesopotamians, etc. The fact that I think, as far as I'm aware, it's the only cosmogony that describes the creation of women. It mentions women, that God created males and females, that it usually just involves males. You never hear women ever talked about. There's a whole host of really interesting things. The fact that human beings made in God's image, that there is something special, unique about human beings that's missing from other ancient cosmogonies, where it was the king, the king who had value. But other human beings did not, and we're reaping the benefits of that tradition today, and it can be frustrating. I think sometimes we're Christian, the emphasis is so often on this issue, and rather than not taking all these other amazing things out of those first early chapters of Genesis.
I think it's really important. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah.
I think recognizing the theology must start in Genesis 1 and go through. And so in that sense, we totally agree. I think as all Christians, but I just don't see Genesis 1, and this is, people can argue with me, I just don't see it as an age issue. I think the age issue does throw up a lot more issues than it's worth arguing over. And particularly when you get into like Genesis 2 and trying to plant Genesis 2 into the middle of Genesis 1, trying to figure out which day fits with which, it becomes really quite messy really quickly. I can't quite harmonize it, and I'm quite happy to be open on it and continue digging. But it sounds like, as Dan was saying, that it's polemical to the cultures of the day, and engaging in the different ways of thinking, the different ways of exploring life as they saw it, and basically saying, well, here's your gods, here's the firmament, here's the thing you think is a god that's propping up the stars, here's the thing you think is a god that's going across the sky, here's the thing you think is a god that's holding all the animals in the sea. Well, you know what? Our God made them. Our God made them, put them into order, and it's only through him that they have their being and their function and order and life. And I find that much better for my theology than trying to say that God made it in a specific scientific way, which sure he did, but it seems like this debate is going to go on forever.
I think apologetically it's just super useful to see God as ordering, the one who provides order to the cosmos. So for me, that there's two kind of big kind of natural theologies that are kind of hinted at Scripture, that there's God is the basis of morality and God is the basis of cosmic order, and both of them are in Genesis, I think. In Genesis 1, that God's saying things are good. He's the one who's deciding what's good and evil. That's one of the main points in the early chapters of Genesis, that he's in charge of the moral realm and he's in charge of the physical realm, and that's the basis of theology, and the reason we can do natural theology, that we can talk to non-believers, is because they are also inhabit the same universe that we do, and God made the fact that it's orderly, and he made their conscience. And he made them in his image as well. Yeah, so these are the core things of theology. And if you take away from Genesis, well, the definition of Yom, if that's your main point, you're missing out.
I think just on that point, just to kind of go a little bit further into what you were saying apologetically, Bread of Life, Rebecca has asked, has Zachary found that his embracing of evolution has helped his Christian witness in the scientific community? Have you found it easier to talk about Christianity?
It's not really about embracing evolution, even, because that makes it sound like I love evolution, and that's and some Christians will go, he loves evolution more than he loves the Bible. It's not about embracing evolution. It's just about not denying it. I mean, personally, I do embrace it because I do actually really love the stuff I study. But for the average Christian or scientist, it's not about whether you embrace something. It's just about what do you focus on? What are you talking about? And if you're talking about stuff that they think is nonsense, that's not going to help. And Augustine had a really nice quote about that that's often used and is famous. It basically says that if non-believers hear us saying nonsense about the stuff that they know something about in science, and they hear us saying that that's tied to a concept of scripture, then they're obviously going to write off scripture. And this is what we see happening, unfortunately, that non-believers are writing off scripture because Christians are saying silly things about science. Not just on the Genesis issue. I think Christians are saying some silly things about science on other issues as well. And that's a really bad witness. And one of the key things that Christian scientists can do is educate the church on these things. Just as Christians in other areas can educate the church in other areas. I think that's one thing that we can do. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Dan, you got another question? I was just scrolling the live chat, see if there's anything else.
I was going to see, I mean, what are sort of scientists' view, like non-theist scientists' views of, do they kind of see an inconsistency? They kind of saying that, would they understand you as saying that they haven't fully understood the picture, that actually, they would understand the evolutionary process to work without any outside involvement? What sort of discussions do you have? What's their kind of view as someone who? Because I think for a lot of modern people, they would see the terms I know you wouldn't necessarily say, but an evolutionary, theistic evolutionary biologist would sound a bit like an oxymoron.
Yeah, I mean, people know that there are a few Christians out there, so they know that someone like Francis Collins exists, who's one of the leading scientists in the world. Undoubtedly, he runs the biggest scientific funding agency in the world. You don't get there unless you're a very good scientist. And so they know that there are some of these people, but they think they kind of have their odd personal views and they're kind of inconsistent. But most just don't know. They don't know Christians who are educated on these things. That's one point. Another point is that most scientists are not atheists. I'm pretty sure about that. A lot of them are agnostics, but that's quite a different kettle of fish than a hardcore atheist. Especially nowadays, I think the tide is very much against the Richard Dawkins type. When the Richard Dawkins type says something in public, most scientists roll their eyes and say, "Not you again, not this old, redundant, antagonistic view." That's really not popular. So I think the tide of the new atheists has gone out, and instead people are kind of open to maybe something spiritual. They're agnostic. They don't see the relevance of Christianity. They don't think that they certainly don't think there's a possibility of a strong evidential case. They think that the evidence and theism is just two different things. So I think there's basically an opening now for natural theology, if it's done well. Yeah. There's lots to say to it.
So just seeing a comment there was something about uneducated. Sounded something about, I don't know if that was us or Zachary mentioning something about, was that a young Earth creationist sounding uneducated? I didn't hear that, but I think I'd be interested to see regarding young Earth creationists. There are a lot of Christians who are young Earth creationists because the Bible says as much. And have you in your professional career seen a young Earth creationist published? Are they being published? Are they engaging in the scientific literature? Are they being persecuted out of it?
Are they what, sorry?
being sort of pushed out?
Yeah, right. They're basically usually not involved. Even the ones who are the kind of token scientists, they're not, for the most part, they're not actually trying to publish. So I would say there is a widespread kind of persecution complex and a claim that the community hates us. There's a little bit of truth to that. They're not popular because they're saying stuff that people, in the same way that anyone who says stuff that people think is crazy, they're not popular. But if they did good science, my sense is that they could be published. So my former boss, he used to be the head of the largest creationist organization in Europe, Wort und Wissen, Word and Science, the German Young Earth Creationist organization. My boss, a number of years ago, he was the head of that. He was publishing science fine. He said he's basically never had a problem. Maybe once or twice had a problem trying to publish his work because people knew his creationist views. In America, I think it's different because things are a bit more polarized. In Europe, people really don't care that much so long as you do good science. My boss changed his view, and now he has similar views to I do. He did a number of years ago. But yeah, so there are these people out there, but they're rare. And for the most part, he was an exception. That was why he became quite prominent, because he was a significant microbiologist who was publishing and was a young earth creationist. But they're increasingly rare, I think. And my sense is that there was kind of I think there was a number of them that were kind of converted to Christianity and or to young earth creationism in the 70s and 80s. And I think since then, I think it's tailing off. I think it's on the decline. You don't see new young earth creation scientists. I think people will push back with examples, but most of these are people who were basically raised to be young earth creationist, and they've just retained that view. You don't see significant converts to young earth creationism, which you did for a short time in the 70s and 80s. And my view is that recent science like genetics has basically made it much harder for biologists to take that kind of view.
Yeah, I think things I've heard from sort of young earth creationist scientists, they'll say that when they try and publish ideas that would support young earth creationists, that's when they would experience pushback. But actually doing the day-to-day work of science, it wasn't, I think the guy who involved in the creation of the magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, was a young earth creationist, but the fact he was a young earth creationist is really incidental to the work that he was doing. It wasn't, it played no role in him. I'm sure his motivations as a Christian, but actually being a young earth creationist didn't really play a part in his scientific discoveries. And that tends to be, what I've seen. I think,
and in his case, I think there is some evidence that he was, I haven't looked into it, but people claim that he lost the Nobel Prize basically because he was a creationist. I don't know if that, in that case, if it's true, but it's plausible that something like that would happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is probably a lot of prejudice against once someone finds out. Especially
but it's the same. But it's the same with any. If people hold a view that people think is crazy and dangerous, and especially in the States, it's seen as dangerous because they're pushing against teaching. So you're threatening kind of. In the States, actually, if you're a creationist and you're involved in politics, you're threatening people's funding, because funding for scientists comes from taxpayers. If the education system becomes anti-evolutionary, then that destroys our ability as scientists to do research. So this is why it becomes kind of a personal, kind of emotive issue for scientists in the States, because it is a real existential threat to their livelihoods and their research program. In Europe, it's just kind of a strange offshoot that some people have, and it's not as threatening in the same way. So it's treated a bit differently, I think.
I think it's really important to highlight that funding is involved, and that makes for questionable science. We're seeing that in other areas. I think we're seeing that.
Right. I mean, the young earth creationists might jump on that and say, "Well, that proves that evolution is just a product of political forces." But you can say that with anything.
It goes both ways. Absolutely.
And so another comment is, maybe they're having troubles publishing stuff in mainstream journals. If they're doing good science, they can publish it in their own journals. There are young earth creationist journals. And just personally, I'm just not very impressed with the science that I'm seeing in that area. Another thing is that there are a few token scientists who are held up as the young Earth creationist scientists. People say, look, the scientists on one side, the scientists on the other side. Oh, it must be 50-50. Science doesn't tell us, but that's really not how it works. The same with all kinds of controversial issues in science. There's a handful of scientists who'll be on, they'll be anti-vaccine. They'll say global warming's not a thing. They'll say smoking doesn't cause cancer. And historically, there's always been a few scientists who they say lockdowns don't work at all. There's always some who'll do that. And yeah, science is more about what does the weight of evidence say. And it's not just about, do you have is there a token person with a PhD you can point to supporting your position?
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. I think, I agree that there seems to be a direct attack on standard things that are accepted within the scientific community. And I think one of the things when it comes to the age of the Earth is generally things like carbon dating is attacked and things that are generally accepted by a majority, and they'll highlight where things have gone potentially wrong. And it seems to be smoothed over for the young Earth creationist arguments to make it compelling for the young Earth creationists to say this is what's actually going on in the scientific community. And then when you hear someone who actually explains the carbon dating and the things that, how you handle errors and how you handle things like that, it actually seems legitimate. But then you've got the question, well, are these young Earth creation scientists representing the community that then don't seem to be a part of, in the sense that either it's through confrontation, as it might be in the States, and there might be some truth, and potentially, someone in the comments has referenced someone who's lost their job about their intelligent design review, or something along those lines. So it's whether are they able to represent the community that they're confronting. And I don't know, it's interesting that you've got your boss was publishing but has now changed his mind. So I just find all that fascinating, and I'd be interested to see if there's anything more to young Earth creationist views if they took their route.
I think a big driver of my impression and my experience talking to people is a big driver of young Earth creationism is presuppositionalism, and that's kind of under the hood. Basically, when you really dig into any expert young Earth creationist who's a scientist, this is going to be controversial. Maybe people will give one or two counterexamples again, but overwhelmingly, the people who are expert young Earth creationist scientists, when you really press them, they're presuppositionalists.
So just for those who aren't down with the lingo, what was presuppositionalist?
So their epistemology, again, another big one, their approach to knowledge is that you should start with scripture, and scripture interprets science, and science is kind of malleable and uncertain, but scripture is rock solid. And by scripture, they mean their interpretation of scripture, obviously. So their young Earth creationist interpretation is basically not up for debate. It doesn't matter what the evidence is. If they're really stuck, they might say, I don't know. But otherwise, if there's any hint, anything that points towards it, they'll say, look, science, proves my view. I see this again and again. Or if either they'll say that, or they'll just be silent. Or if you really press them on a hard issue, they'll say, yeah, that's a hard issue. But it's not, the science is playing no role, evidentially, in their view. And I think that's basically dishonest. If they're then presenting it as the science is what's driving their view, when if you actually scratch them under the surface, they're a presuppositionalist, and that's what's really driving their view, because they're of course, if you're an expert, you're aware of the hard problems, but they never raise them in their talks, and they present it very one-sidedly. Is commonly what happens. So the other thing I wanted to say is that I think on any of these issues, a good thing for a layperson in the pews to do is say, what's the consensus of evangelical experts on this topic? And the consensus of evangelical geologists is not young Earth creationism. The consensus of evangelical molecular geneticists is not anti-evolutionism. The more people study in each of these areas, the more likely they're going to be take the evolutionary view. And young Earth creationists, so that's just the bias of the education system. But I think it's really not, because there's a bunch of people like my former boss, Zachary Ardern, who's undoubtedly one of the most prominent former creationists in Europe. A bunch of other people I could name, who were committed young Earth creationists, and they changed their views. And you don't see the other. You don't see things happening, people going the other way. Yeah.
That's good. So we've only got 10 minutes left, and we've got one big question.
Can I ask something quickly?
Go
just
on.
in regards to the fossil record, I know you said that it's not your your specialization, but you would see it is odd that if young Earth creationism were true, like you said, you would expect to see mixing of these different, like you'd see evidence in the fossil record of where more modern animals or more modern animal forms and structures are mixed with things we consider to be older and more ancient, and yet we don't see it. So it's just really odd, because like you said, the guy, I can't remember who it was, you said about seeing a rabbit with, we don't see humans near dinosaurs or foxes with old in the Cambrian explosion. You don't see that. Like there clearly is some sort of development going on. And all right, worst case scenario, you may say, okay, well, those changes happened over a very short period. Okay, perhaps, but you literally you do not see the pattern you would expect if all life arose 6,000 years ago. I mean, that is one of the things that just strikes me as, it just seems implausible. You don't see what you would expect to see fundamentally, if that were the case. And I don't know how you get around that. I'm not an evangelist for either side, because I read both sides, but what we see in the fossil record doesn't match up, and it does seem to support, as what you argue for is change over some period of time, whether it's billions of years or whatever. But you don't see what you expect from the young Earth creationist account. And I don't think the flood really helps you either. I have to be honest, I don't see how a flood would order things in a way that you would expect to see, given the the animal forms both in the sea and on land. You don't see it. You get less complex to more complex generally.
Yeah, so creationists have tried to explain that in terms of ecological zones, and to some extent you can kind of imagine, okay, the stuff at the bottom, that was because maybe during the flood. So the stuff at the bottom is like, you only see fish kind of near the bottom, say, and that was because during the flood, that's where the fish were in these lower areas that were lakes or seas or whatever. But I think that's basically being kind of acknowledged, that the data is just way more subtle than that. It's not just these ecological zones to account for, and it really does look like this kind of development. And the other thing, just keep pushing what I said before, is that I think young Earth creationists really benefit when and also atheists actually do something similar, when they show it as a dichotomy. It's either young Earth creationism or it's this full-blown Darwinian evolution. They love the term Darwinian because that also has kind of a gut. Christians tend not to like that. They think Darwin was bad. They think he was an atheist or something. He wasn't, but they think he was anti-Christian. So young Earth creationists will label the alternative as Darwinian evolution, where actually the first question is, well, is the Earth old? And that's got nothing to do with Darwinian evolution. People believed that before Darwin. People were forced to believe that. Evangelicals were uncomfortable with this, but they were like, we can't explain the geological features we see with the global flood. And so the mainstream evangelical geologists in the 1820s or 30s or whatever, before Darwin, they had come to accept that there was an old Earth based on the geology. So yeah, we really shouldn't conflate them together. And I think rhetorically, the young Earth creationists kind of often get a lot of support rhetorically by conflating the age of the Earth issue with the question of the specific evolutionary mechanism, and that's just a separate issue. Yeah.
I was just responding, just looking at some of the comments responding to we find marine fossils in every mountaintop in the world. But if you understand plate tectonics and volcanoes, started on the ground, or below the ground. So it again, it's a presupposition that the Earth was flooded and fish ended up on mountain ranges, because given enough, the time we've seen. We see new islands forming volcanoes and things that what was on the ground under the sea becoming over the sea. So we have examples of that. So I'm not. So I was just quickly running through, Zachary. So I was just looking through some of the comments quickly as we catch up.
The question that we haven't touched on at all, and we've only got 5 minutes before I have to start closing up tonight. Just be interested, like, we haven't even touched on Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2. I'd be interested.
Well, you've got 5 minutes. You want to start talking about that?
Yeah, I'm tempted. Well, we asked earlier. I'd just be interested. You said you could touch on it for a few seconds. I'll be interested. Like, what have you read so far on it, and where are you on the question of Adam and Eve?
Yeah, I mean. So it seems. So yeah, what do we mean by Adam and Eve? I guess. So when we say Adam and Eve, do we necessarily mean that they were the only two humans around at the time? That's one of the big questions. So is it possible that Adam and Eve were representatives of a group of some sort, and that from Genesis 1? Sure, I would say that, and there's an interesting ambiguity between Adam, man, Adam, and human. It's the same word. So there's actually some ambiguity. When does it talk about human? I mean, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, obviously, but from what I read, there's some ambiguity in when's it talking about humankind and when's it talking about a specific man. And I think that because of that gives rise to some of the variation in the different models. And there's a range of models, but so one possibility is that Adam and Eve were representatives of a group. That could have been at different time points. That could be a very recent thing, 10,000 years ago, the origin of farming, 20,000 years or something. Or it could be further back. It could be 200, 300,000 years ago, the origin of modern humans. Or it could be 1 million or more years ago, the origin of the human, hominids in general. So there's different time spans.
Yeah.
And so there's different time spans. There's also different population sizes that we could talk about. I think the genetics basically rules out a single couple origin being recent, but it's possible that we had a single couple origin. So they were the only two humans around at all. If we go back further, so if we go back, the models say at least if we go back 500,000 years, then it's okay. So we could have maybe have a single couple 500,000 years ago. The other complexity is that you have Neanderthal and Denisovans, or Denisovans, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which are these other human-like creatures. At least Neanderthal, I think, very clearly are humans. I think Denisovans as well. And they seem to go a bit further back in the fossil record. So this is why some people at, say, the Discovery Institute, which is the Intelligent Design Center, whole other topic we didn't even talk about.
No, I haven't even touched on
it. Some of these people prefer a really ancient origin with a single origin, ancient origins to humans with a single couple. And then they think the whole Homo genus, I think, originated with a single couple back then with Homo erectus, something like 2 million years ago, as I understand. There's different theological reasons for some of this. One of the key things that's driving it actually is that for Catholics, for Roman Catholics, it's the doctrine of a single couple is important. So because that was said by someone authoritative at some time, so conservative Catholics hold that as really important. There's all kinds of questions. What counts as human? What do we mean by human? So then, there's other models like the genealogical Adam and Eve, but explaining that would take more time.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I just want to, obviously, we haven't got that much time, but it's just interesting. I like that you've sort of mapped out a wide variety of views. I think that's where I'm at with it, to be honest, and I'm looking to try and get other people on who've looked at this in more detail, and maybe we can discuss a bit further.
Good to look
just
at
another thing.
Yeah, go on.
just another thing I say really quickly, that it doesn't mean that I lose sleep over it, is because the science has changed a lot actually recently in the last few years.
Yeah.
So if the atheist pushes me on this, I'm comfortable, because I'd say, well, actually the science isn't clear anyway. We keep finding new human fossils, which kind of messes up the tree a bit. It's basically a bit of a mess, whatever your view is. And we're still working that out. Maybe we'll never know, because we don't know what it means to be human in a theological sense. That's one of the key questions, and that's not a scientific question, but maybe the science can help us talk about that. But it depends what we think of as the image of God as well. Do we even think of that in terms of stuff that you could measure somehow through science? If you don't, then the science is actually kind of going to be irrelevant to how we map it up.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm always trying to be so cautious, is because about saying what is the Christian view of creation, because it changes, interpretations change, science changes. As you get more information. Only this week, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Dragon Man fossils discovered in China. It's very complex. Like, there are clearly, human-like fossils. And I don't know. I'll ask Jesus when we meet one day, because I don't know. And I think you do have to be careful on both sides about having certainty or something that's actually largely unclear. And as new information comes in, we have to revise. That's how science works, isn't it? You revise your hypothesis on the basis of new information that's introduced, or an alternative hypothesis. I don't know. I don't think Genesis is talking about, I think it's talking about the what, not the how. I think if you think Genesis is explaining the how and the what, then I guess you'll look at it very differently, won't you?
And just super quickly, I think the text allows for some of this openness, because there is this ambiguity between human and man in Adam. That is one of the key things, because there's the question of where is Cain getting his wife from. The text doesn't answer that. He goes on to build a city pretty quickly. Where are those people populating the city? Where are they from? That opens the possibility there are other people. That's, I mean, either way, there's kind of some awkwardness. And there's the Nephilim, which is a whole other crazy thing happening.
But Cain's also worried about other people killing him. So that there's something, there's something in that. So I think before we go down any other rabbit holes, we'll have to have you on again, Zachary. This has been really interesting, because we haven't. There's still quite a few things we haven't even touched on yet. But just on a note in the comments, talking about Jesus taking Genesis literally with Adam, and we haven't even touched on death before sin and the fall, predation. We haven't. So this is probably the first exploration of evolution we've actually had on this channel. So for those of you with all the questions and comments, that's fine. We'll have a conversation on this again another time. But just to say, Jesus taking Genesis literally, well, the same issue applies. Like, we're taking it literally. We're just doing the best we can with the text, and Jesus taking it literally. I think it would have been odd if he started explaining evolution to his audience. I think God incarnates into the creation, and his context brings about truth with the context that he's in, and Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew. I think it would have been very odd to start presenting modern science 2,000 years ago. That would have probably caused more confusion than his resurrection did. So I think we're going to leave it on that. And Zachary, before we go, we always ask our guests this. Resources, that's the question. What can we read, or what would you recommend we listen to? Any good documentaries for those of us who are more visual? What do you recommend? A couple of things, and then we'll close up.
On the theology, I'm a big fan of C. John Collins. If you want a debate, look at the debate between him and Albert Mohler. He explains lots of things. There's quite a long debate. There's a bunch of material there. On the science, there's from a secular point of view, discussing some of the stuff I think is important, suggesting some kind of fine-tuning. There's a guy called Andreas Wagner, who's a leading evolutionary biologist. There's also the Christian paleontologist Simon Conway Morris. who is at Cambridge. There's the Christian evolutionary biologist at Harvard, Martin Novak. These are all leading evolutionary biologists. Andreas Wagner, I don't think he's a Christian, but they're all pointing to some kind of similar things, that there's some kind of need maybe for fine-tuning, or Novak has other ideas about how God might be involved in the evolutionary process. So there are leading scientists in this area who are either Christian or who are saying things that are interesting. And Christians shouldn't be scared of evolution. They shouldn't think it's, they should be happy to talk with their non-Christian friends about it. And that's actually the main thing I'd want to say, is that don't give this ground to the atheists. This is not a point in favor of atheism. This is not something Christians should be scared of. You shouldn't teach your kids implicitly to be scared of evolution. That's going to destroy them when they come to learn about it in biology class in high school. God, Christians have been involved in science since the beginning. God made the universe, and we can explore it, and that's fine.
Awesome. Agreed. I think very helpful, Zachary. Loads of stuff that I'm still realizing how little I know about biology and science in general, but I think I followed most of that tonight. There's a reason I generally leave this conversation to other people. Dan, any final comments?
No, I think it's just been interesting. I guess going to the next question, which you asked a bit in terms of what we said about resources and stuff. Because what sort of should Christians sort of read secular books about evolution? I think is there benefit to be gained on trying to understand the kind of mechanisms and processes of evolution?
If they're into it, it's a niche topic, and most people shouldn't waste their time on it. But probably the same with any other. Should Christians, investigate the Big Bang in detail? If you want to do that, you're going to need the maths of relativity theory. If you want to investigate evolution in detail, you're going to need, molecular genetics, or whatever area you want to look into. We should, I think apologetics is helpfully moving past the idea where you have one smart dude who knows everything about everything. That's not realistic, and it's instead Christians should specialize in given the circumstances and giftings and education. And there's a lot of hobbyist Christians who delve into evolution from an amateur view, and they do a bad job of it, unfortunately, because they're not well trained. It's better if people want to do that. They should talk to the experts. They should take feedback. And most Christians, it's enough to have a general view and focus on the main things, like God created the universe. He's the reason why there's order and comprehensibility, and why there's a moral sphere, and all these things are more important than the mechanisms of evolution. But if people want to specialize in it, then that's great. We need more people doing that as well.
Thank you, Slamaran, in the comments for moderating as well. Appreciate that. Just a final comment from I think we should read all the science. It's up to us how to interpret the data, and that's the best we can do. And if you're a Christian, pray that the Holy Spirit helps you interpret the Bible and stay true to Christ as you follow him. We'll end on that note, and thanks again, all of you who've watched and given comments and disagreed politely. That's been great, and hopefully we'll have another conversation on this topic soon. Just to let you know, just before I do close, we've got Sam Chan on the channel next Thursday. Sam Chan has written a book called Evangelism in a Skeptical World. It's my favorite book of whenever it was written, 2019 I think it was, but he's done loads of stuff. He's Australian, Asian Australian guy, got lots of experience in talking about Christianity and showing that it's plausible and a good thing to believe in. So we'll have a lot of conversation with him next week. Join us then about the same time, 8 o'clock next Thursday. But once again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all soon.